These are the new features that you'll see when we run Archicad 23. As JWH Group, we won't actually be using 23, we'll be skipping straight to 24, so you'll see them as new features in version 24. The first thing you'll notice is when you start Archicad 23 from the icon, not just double clicking a PLN file but actually opening the program itself, you'll be greeted with this new start menu. It's quite simple. The new button you can ignore, that's the default Archicad template which we don't ever use. We'll go browsing for our own template or an existing file if it's not in the list below. You can choose whichever file you like. You can ignore teamwork because we don't use it. This section here will show you all your previous files that you've opened before. I don't have a lot of files that I've opened already because I've just recently installed 23, but you can see here you've got the list of files. They can be either as icons or a list of details, whichever you prefer. You can filter. Once this list gets quite long, you can filter for keywords. If you've got a particular job number or a client name, you can filter by that. There's a settings dialog here which you can ignore again because it's already set. We just want to migrate if we happen to be using older versions of libraries, and this is the Graphisoft library, not our library. If we're using older versions of Graphisoft library, it will migrate automatically to the new one. You can also sort the files by name, last use, size or type, and you can also invert the list, so whether you want to go from, like with name, in alphabetical order, ascending or descending. These are the previews of the files. Not only are they listing the files that you've used, but they're actually previews. So if you hover the mouse over it, you'll actually see previews of all the currently open tabs, plans, sections, layouts, etc. So you can get an idea. If the actual name of the file doesn't mean a lot to you, you can actually see the content of the file now before you even open it. This one here is my PLN, but it's not showing any content because I haven't browsed through it recently. And this one here is showing not available, but it's no longer in the current position where I had saved it. It was in my user file. It's no longer there, so Archicad knows that the file is not available. If I want to and I no longer need it, I can simply click this delete button and that's no longer in the list. It's actually a good idea to try and keep this list as small as possible. Let it accumulate some files. But I have heard, and I believe they've fixed it, but there was a bug where when the file list gets quite long, it can slow Archicad down, especially the starting of Archicad. So it may, from time to time, you might want to come through and just prune off all the older files. So you can sort them by last accessed or last used and just prune off all the old files, delete them. You can, of course, quit Archicad. This is a link to the Help Center, which is a website with all of the help files stored on it, so you'll actually get live versions of the help file rather than the stored PDF version that's inside Archicad. And then once you select your file, you can either double click it here to open it, or you can select it and then say open. So this is Archicad open. I've just got a demo file here with samples of all of the new features, which I'll go through in turn. So that's the new starting dialog that we've seen with various files that are there. If you've got a crashed version of Archicad, so if one of your files crashed while you had the file open, you'll get this logo with like a safety ring around it. That just means that it's a previously crashed version that was never saved. So this is the autosave document which you can open and then continue working as you would have before. That's your new start dialog. Now if you go into the help menu, these images that you'll see here may not be particularly clear because they're not a very good quality. I've just saved them into here as a reference for me to talk about. But if you go into the help menu, documentation, Archicad 23 reference guide, and open that PDF up, what you'll find in here is if you go down to Archicad 23 new features guide, there'll be a list of all the new features. And you can go through this and see all the new features, which is what I'll be talking about in this video. So you can read about it in more detail if you want to. The next thing that Archicad has that's new is what they call the Action Center. The Action Center gives you details on the health of the file. So you'll see it up here, this Action Center tab. will come up here. It's got a red dot. A red dot means there's something that needs attention or should be looked at. So just clicking on here, it shows me 6 possible things that need attention in here. A red icon will mean that it needs to be looked at and you should sort something out. A green obviously means it's healthy and everything is okay. And an orange icon is just saying that it may be something you want to look at. So we'll start at the front here. So it's saying libraries. It's got a little warning here saying something's wrong with the libraries. So I can just click that icon and it's saying here that some library parts are missing. Okay, so that's a regular message that we've got. So I can come into here and I can check my libraries. It'll actually just go through and reload all the libraries and check to see what's going on. In this case, it's going to be loading the same libraries. So I've got the same problems that library parts are missing. I can show a summary. The summary is actually just a summary of all 6 icons here. Or I can now go here and I can say, look, let's open up the library manager and let's see what the problem is. So I'll open up the library manager, and in here is all my currently loaded libraries, which, as I would expect, is correct. So I've got the embedded library, I've got the stairs and rails 23, I've got the textures and pictures, and I've got my JWH library 23. Now I've got 6 warnings here of missing library parts, and it's saying that there's a missing library part from version 18, and it happens to be a tree in plan, an old tree object, and it happens to be 6 instances of that tree. It's obviously something I haven't looked at in this demo file. It should be okay in the template. I've fixed it up in there. But in here there's an old copy of a tree plan in one of the sketch layers, and I just haven't updated it to a newer tree. So I'm quite happy with that. I need to go and fix this. I need to go and track down the tree and change it to a new object. I'm not going to worry about that in this particular case. So I'm quite happy with that, so I can say okay and cancel. It just means that this warning will not go away until I fix it, which is the ideal thing that you should do. You should fix it. The hot links, I don't have any hot links, so they're all okay. The drawings, it's saying here that the drawings need to be checked. So I've got some drawings on layouts that may be out of date. I can go into the drawing manager and check them. I'm quite happy with that. I will leave that, and you can worry about the drawings as you update the layouts. But again, this demo is not about how to model and use Archicad layouts. You all know that already. Reports, no events have been reported, so there's nothing. The reports is that a text list that comes up in Archicad from time to time telling you what's going on. Licenses are all okay, so our licenses are fine. We can check license information if we want to. And updates here, it's telling me that Archicad's not up to date, so I can download the updates and install those updates and make sure Archicad is the newest available version. So I'm okay with this Action Center. So there are some errors that need sorting, but we can close the Action Center off and ignore it. If it's important and as you're working on the job, you do something that forces another action to become incorrect, that Action Center will just reappear. Some people find it a little bit annoying in that it comes up every time the drawings need to be updated, but it's there for a reason. You need to determine whether you want to complete that action or not and solve the problem. Ideally solve the problem, the Action Center will go away and it won't bother you until the next problem arises. But that's something to keep an eye out, and that's what it's there for. The next thing is the navigation among tabs is a little bit different. Not a lot different. The tabs are still there, so you've got tabs along the top there. But what you can do now is you can hover your mouse over the tab and you'll actually see a preview of what was in that tab. So you can get an idea of what you're going to see. So I can now click in that tab to open it if I want to. The other thing that you've got here now is a preview or an overview of all the tabs, and I can click on that and it shows me all the tabs on the screen at one time. So if I want to, for example, jump to the 3D screen, 3D tab, I can just click on that and it will open up the 3D window. Obviously a bit of a mess because it's just the demo. So that's really all that is new about that. If you drag your mouse quickly across to get to a tool, it probably won't be a problem, but if you're a little bit slower, you'll find that preview will appear, and some people again will find that annoying. Unfortunately, that's just the way that it is. So you have to bring your mouse away and leave it for half a second while it disappears. The other new thing that's a little bit different is with your layout pages. The frames for the drawings that you place on your layouts have a new option now as well. If I go and open up an elevation here, if you can see, the frame here has a very fine dotted border. That means that it's this new feature which they call crop to frame. Crop to frame basically means that the drawing behind it, if I stretch this out, the drawing behind it has been cropped to that frame, so it's not including the extra information here. Now at any time when I change this frame size, I can say update to frame, and it will force that drawing to now update to show that frame. But if I stretch it out again, it's no longer including the extra information that is actually out there. Again, I could just update this and it will update, so I can constantly keep updating that. If I stretch it back in and then I stretch it back out, it remembers that that was there. So it remembers what was shown previously. Until I stretch it further, it remembers the old cutoff area. The reason for this is that the drawings can now be cropped and not show the information around the outside, whereas previously it was the old one here, which was manually resized frame, which was the dashed frame around it. And the manually resize, even though the frame was drawn in closer, it still remembers all the information that's outside of this frame. So the entire drawing is being remembered in Archicad. Now with the crop to frame version of it, it will not remember all this extra information. So the file size should hopefully be a little bit smaller. So it's just something to watch out for. If you've got this and you extend it, you just need to watch. So now that it's cropped to frame, it's not remembering that information outside of that area. So if you want to use this feature, fine, just make sure that these are all cropped to frame. If you don't, just reset it to be the manually resized. I still need to update that in this case. So I need to update this frame because I've just changed it. So that's just a new option with frames. The beam and column tools have been completely rewritten now. They are very similar to each other in all of their features, with some exceptions which I'll explain as we go along. The first new feature is the geometry method. There's a new two-click placement method which allows us to position our beams and columns. The geometry methods are the same that we had before, with the addition of this new one here, which is the two-click method. Best used in 3D or in sections and elevations. What it allows is to place a beam or a column by 2 points, which will automatically define the angle or the slope of that beam or column. So if you look here, I've got two walls which are different heights. If I go and select whether it's a beam or a column, it doesn't matter, as I say, because they're very similar to each other now. If I select this new two-click geometry method, and I'm placing, in this case, a column that's 2.6 meters high, and it's a vertical column, so even though it's vertical, it is going to slope. When I click the base point for my floor slab, because I've got the 2-point method, you can see here it's allowing me to just go and pick any other point at random. So if I pick the top corner of this wall here, it will snap to that corner. If I do exactly the same on the corner of that slab to this wall, you can see that the walls are different heights and the columns have come out accordingly. So they're literally snapping to the 2 points that you define. If you did this in floor plan has no Z height, so it doesn't recognize the height of these walls. It will use the position of the column in the X and Y plane, so it will use the edge of the wall, but the height of the column will still be 2.6 meters high, so it would use that point. I'll just show you in plan actually. So if I use that point there, so I'm using the column tool with the two-click placement method. I click at that point there, I come across here perpendicular to the wall. If we now look at that in 3D, you will see exactly what I mean. So it's used the position of the wall, but it's used the height, which was 2.6 meters, and it's adjusted the angle accordingly to suit that. So it's used the 2 points in the X and Y plane, but it didn't know it's used the height of the column for the Z plane, whereas in 3D it will use the X and Y coordinates, and it will also use the height that you're snapping to as well, and it will adjust the column angle to suit. The next new feature is they've changed the construction types, is more consistent between columns and beams now, so that you now have the option for rectangular, circular or custom profile, and that's for both beams and columns now. So it's just this here, so rectangular, circular, custom profiles. Improved graphical editing for columns. What that means is that if you take a column now, you used to be able to select a column only by the nodes, the 9 nodes. You can now select a column by the edge. So any edge that you select, you can now use as a selection point. Even columns like this, which is a segmented column, which I'll get to in a moment, this is all one column consisting of piers and capitals and timber posts. I can now click on any edge and activate that column, select that column. The next is columns and beams will now have an axis. Just like walls have a reference line, beams have always had a reference line, columns have always had that 9-point axis reference. Beams and columns now have the same 9-point axis reference. By moving that reference, what will happen is the column will actually move. The reference point stays in the same location. So here you can see that I've got my center points. So if I draw a line from the center point of this column just as a reference, and then I select that column and I change the axis point, reference axis location, you can see that the column moves, the axis point stays exactly where it was, so the reference line is in effect staying where it was and the column is physically moving. That's the same when you select a wall. You've got the reference line of a wall, and if I change that from the inside to the outside, the reference line stays where it is and the wall changes position. So when I change these, there's now consistency between columns, beams and walls. The reference line will stay exactly where it was and the columns and beams will now move in regards to that reference line. The offset for beams, so with a beam such as this one here, with a beam you can still have the 9 reference points, which refers to it in section, the 9 reference, whether you want the top, the bottom, the left or the right or the center. The offset, which is the offset of the beam from the reference line, is the offset in plan. So you can see here I've got an offset of 100 mils. So my reference point of the beam is the top center in 3D, so the reference point is here, but I've offset it from that reference line by 100 millimeters. So if I set that back to 0, you'll see what will happen is that will now snap back to the 0 point. So that will now snap back to exactly at the center of the beam. So my top center reference point. If I look at that in 3D, you can see that my beam has, again, the 9 points, which is the top center. If I pick the center, you'll see that the reference line is now in the center. If I pick the bottom, it's now in the bottom. If I pick the bottom right, it's now in the bottom right. So that axis point or the axis line will stay exactly as it was and the beam will move to suit. Next we have the angled end cuts. This is a little bit hard to explain with clarity, but basically what it is we now have end rotations, if you like, for the top and bottom surfaces of beams and columns, or the end surfaces of beams and top and bottoms of columns. There's 3 options that we have, and it's these ones here. So if I look at again the column tool, we have a vertical column. I can adjust the top and bottom angles of that column. We've got a choice of horizontal, perpendicular or custom. You can see in this case, because I've got a vertical column, I cannot have a vertical top edge because it would literally be cutting the column away to nothing. Same applies with a horizontal beam. You cannot have a horizontal end. You can only have a vertical or a custom. If I choose an inclined beam and it's not set at 90 degrees, all 3 options will be available. So I've got some columns here which I can hopefully explain it a little bit. So I've got 3 columns here. This is just a regular column. It's inclined at an angle of 70 degrees. This is the same column, but I've rotated it by 90 degrees in plan. So it's still inclined at 70 degrees, just rotated around by 90 degrees. And this is the same column where I haven't rotated in plan, I've rotated on the axis. So I've actually twisted the column on its own axis. So it's still sloping at 70 degrees, but it's twisting on its axis. So if we look at those in 3D, you can see what we've got there. At the moment I've got them all set to a vertical end. Because they're inclined, they can have a vertical end, and you can see exactly that. The ends are vertical. The ends will always be vertical in relation to the inclination of the column. So my inclination angle here is 70 degrees. That vertical end will be perpendicular to that 70 degrees. So it has to be perpendicular to that end. So again, here you can see this one, the inclination angle is that way, and it's vertical, and the same for the one that's rotated. The inclination angle is exactly the same as this one here, and you can see the vertical ends are perfectly vertical in relation to that inclination angle. So even though it's rotated on the axis, the end is vertical. If I change those to a horizontal, you can obviously see that the tops are now all horizontal. So regardless of their position or rotation, the tops will always be horizontal. Same will apply for the bases. But if I now select this and say I want a custom angle for the non-rotated columns, the custom angle, and it's all stretchy here in the pet palette, there's an option here to rotate the end angle. That end angle is always perpendicular to the rotation of the column. So in this case, my column is not rotated at all. It's got a rotation angle here of 0 degrees. So my custom end angle is rotating perpendicular to that 0 degree rotation. Here, my column is rotated 90 degrees, but my axis rotation is still 0. So you'll see here that, again, it's perpendicular to the rotation angle of the column. Not the actual rotation of the column, is perpendicular to the rotation angle of the axis of the column. This one here, which I've rotated, so effectively it's the same column as this, the same inclination angle, but I've rotated the actual column on its axis, and you'll see here now when I go to stretch that end angle, it's perpendicular to the rotation angle. It's not pulling forward like this one. If I select this one and rotate the angle, you can see that it's perpendicular to the rotation of the axis. So again, it's the rotation of the axis. It's not perpendicular to the inclination of the column. So what that allows us to do is very easily now, which we couldn't do before, is things like picture frames or window frames, reveals around windows, trims around windows. We can easily miter the ends here, so I can simply grab that column. It doesn't matter what node I select, I'll get the same option here to rotate, and it always rotates about the axis point. So the axis point is the pivot for this rotation angle. So I can simply come into here and I can just type 45 degrees, except in this case I need negative 45 degrees. And in this one here, again, I can pick any point on it and choose my rotation angle end, and again type in here, or I can even snap because I've got an existing point there now, and you can see it's quite easy to set up the trim. So it's very easy to create a window frame or a door trim or something like that. So now if I isolate these two columns on their own, you'll see that if I rotate the angle of this column, the end is rotating in that direction. If I rotate the angle of this column, you can see it's rotating in a completely different direction. That's because this column here has an axis rotation of 90, and this column here has an axis rotation of 0. So effectively it's exactly the same column, it's just one's been rotated on its axis to manipulate the position of that inclination plane. Having said that, if you had a column that was not equal in size, so for example 300 by 100 column, when I adjust this inclination angle, again, as I say, it follows the rotation angle of the column. If I wanted it to rotate across this side here, there's nothing I can do about that. I physically have to swap this column size-wise, 100 by 300, to make it go the other way. I then have to rotate the column 90 degrees in plan. So I can pick that point there and rotate it by 90 degrees. What that will allow me to do now is to adjust that column angle, end angle. I'm now adjusting the end angle on the it's hard to see, but I'm adjusting the end angle on the skinny side now instead of along the length. So unfortunately you can't choose to adjust the rotation angle of just the top plane. You have to literally rotate the column and then adjust the width and the depth to be the opposite of what they were. The beams and columns can also be segmented now. What that means is that we can have one beam or one column made up of many components. An example of that is here. So this is one beam, and if I look at that in 3D, you'll see what we have. We actually have one beam, but it consists of 3 separate segments. Each of these segments can be controlled independently from each other, whether it be different sizes, different materials, different thicknesses, different end angles, if you like. So each segment end is customizable. For example, I can grab this end, but I must grab it on the reference line, and I can choose to use this rotation joint angle, and I can simply rotate that angle whichever way I like. It can be vertical, can be on any angle that you want. So with this beam, it behaves the same as what was before, but if you go into the beam settings now, what you'll find is there's a whole new system for the settings. We still have the basic beam width and height, and the length of the beam, and the height above floor level or story. But what you've now got is also segments, and you can have as many segments as you like. You can add and remove. I won't go into a lot of detail here. You can look at the beam video or column videos on the Archicad YouTube channel, and I hope to create some videos explaining this more in depth for our own users. Each one of these segments, they're all selectable. You can choose how they interact with each other. They can be independent, so one can be rectangular, one can be circular. So if I select this middle one here, you can see here now I've changed that into a circle, and literally as you select them, the correct segment will highlight here. But you can choose what you like. You choose the materials, the building materials. You can choose whether they are uniform size or whether they actually taper. So this beam can actually taper from 300 to 300 at the moment, but if I go into the settings here, I can taper it down from 300 to 100 at the end. Because it's a circular segment, it's tapering from a circle to another circle, and I can't control the width. But if it was a rectangular segment like this one here, when I go into the taper, I can taper the width and the height at the same time. So this one is going from a 300 deep by 100 beam at one end, and I can change it to a, say, 150 by 400 beam at the other, and you'll see what happens there. So if we look at that back in 3D, you can see I've completely destroyed this, but it's one beam now, but completely controlled by segments. The end cut's still in play, so the join here is still a tapered end. It just happens to be that the ends of the columns are not the same as each other, so if you wanted to, you could have the end of this column match the end of that column quite easily just by adjusting the sizes and widths. So as I say, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here about what they can and can't do, but you have pretty good control. You can still put holes in beams if you want to, which we could before. You have now separate floor plan control for things like colours of the beams, the line colours and line types, and of course we have favourites. Eventually what we can do is we can set up a bunch of favourites for different scenarios. We could have, for example, a segmented beam that is used for exposed rafters. So you could have a tapered end or a different thickness end. You might have an exposed rafter internally that's 200 deep, and out on the eaves you only want it to be 100 deep. So we can cut down an end segment and trim that, or we can have different scenarios where we've got perpendicular ends or vertical ends, or even different tapers on the ends. So we can set up some favourites for different scenarios as we come across those. Beams also now have the ability to curve vertically. So if I look at this beam, you can see that this beam is now curving in a vertical direction. It's easy to control just simply by dragging the reference node. There's a new option here to curve vertically. So I can just simply control that curve as much as like be a negative curve as well if you want to. The only thing you can't do is you can't have a beam curving in two directions. So I can't take this beam here. I can add a node to it, and that's basically splitting it into a separate segment. So I can add segments to it, but I can't curve this beam horizontally as well as vertically at the same time. So it's not possible to do that. Whereas this beam here, you can see I can curve because it's flat. So if we look at that in 3D, because it's flat, I can curve it horizontally, but I can no longer curve that vertically. So it's one or the other. The other part of segmentation is that the segments can be controlled individually, as I've mentioned, but the lengths of those segments, whether again be beams or columns, the lengths of the segments can be controlled as a percentage of the overall length, or it can be a fixed length. So if we look at, for example, this column here, which I've made up, this is simply it's a single column made up of 5 segments. So there's one segment here for the base, one segment for the pier, a flat segment here for the corbel, a tapering segment for the taper on top, and then another segment for the timber post. And if we look at those segments, you'll see that the timber post on top, at the moment this is a fixed size. So if I was to try to adjust the height of this column here and adjust the height, you can see here that the brick section is the bit that's adjusting, and all these other sections, the base, the corbel, the timber post, they're all staying the same size. That's because in the settings, the timber post section has got a fixed length of that. The rendered corbel on top again is fixed at 86 mils. The flat corbel part underneath is again fixed at 172, but my brickwork is a percentage, which means that it's adjustable, so it has no fixed length. If I was to fix the length, I could fix the length. This column now is completely locked. You can see the symbols down the side here. This column would be completely locked and wouldn't be adjustable in height, but I can adjust that. And you can have more that are percentages. If you have more percentages, then you literally have more adjustable sections. You have a percentage for each one. So each one becomes an adjustable percentage, if you like, of it. But if you just want the one segment that's adjustable, then it doesn't have an actual, because it's 100% adjustable. So you can proportion, if you have multiple adjustments, you can proportion how much of each section gets adjusted. We can also use copy and paste to transfer data between segments. So if you look at these columns that I've got here, so long as we go into edit mode, you can now alt click a segment of the column and then control alt click to inject those properties into that section there. You can also, in the column settings, I can also right click on a segment and copy the segment structure, and I can then go to another one and I can then paste that information back to that one. So all the same settings apply, so whether the structure type, the materials, the sizes will all apply to that. The only thing that won't adjust is the height, because that segment is set to a certain height. Each segment will stay set as it was. So it is possible to copy and paste between segments too if we need to. The segment modelling, which we've just briefly looked at, again, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here. I'll do another movie, or again look at the YouTube channels. But it is possible to create quite complex profiles if you want to. All of these are single beams or single columns with different profiles, tapering. Again, we can use complex profiles to get the fluted effect there. You can use section modifiers to taper the profile, so that's exactly the same profile, but it would be tapered. Here's my quick attempt at some different beams and columns. You can see here we've got just a regular beam there, but then I can change that into a beam with segments. So I have, in this case, 5 different segments. This segment tapers down to this size here. This segment here is a complex profile, so we just have a regular size segment there. This segment here then tapers from that size down to a smaller size. It then joins onto a complex profile I-beam, and that happens to be that particular size. So the size of this beam happens to match the size of that end taper. We've got the complex profiles, so, and then it just repeats going back the other way, so we just have a tapering beam. So we have segment section that's tapering, and then a regular segment that's not tapering, and they just all join together, creating that column. So you can see here now that when I stretch this, it's been set so that all of these will stretch proportionally, but the beam in essence stays exactly the same as it was before. And then similar for these look very complicated, but these are basically one column. You can see here as I stretch it, the sections that are adjustable are the sections in between, and the actual capitals or the connections on the columns are fixed sizes, so they will not stretch. And it's just made up of a series of segments. Each segment you can go through and start at the very top is just a plain plate. Then we've got an I-beam. Then we've got another plain plate. So they can get quite detailed in what you do. There's an H profile here that creates that. It's then the same profile below, but this one here now tapers top to bottom. So it's a case of stacking all these different profiles on top of each other, and you come out with something like that. So again, there's your flat plate, there's the I-beam sitting in this part, another flat plate, then you've got this section from there to there. You can see the nodes here. If I stretch that around a little bit, it might line it up a little bit better. So that section from there to there is just a regular H section, or what they call the H profile. Then it's the same profile below, but it just tapers to a smaller end. And then there's another flat beam, and then there's again just the I-beam, and then it'll be another flat beam, and then an I-beam, and then a flat beam. Or say a flat beam, a flat plate, and then another I-beam, another flat plate, the same H configuration. etc. And then the same thing but inverted around the other way. So it can look complicated, but you can actually get some quite good results with it. Again, each one of these segments, so you can see the segment heights here, so each one of these segments is a different complex profile, or in the case of something like this, just a plane shape or a plane shape that's tapered. And in this case of the flute, it's a complex profile that's tapered. So best of both worlds. And again here, 3 sections, and they actually happen to be all the same profile in plan, and they just taper to different heights. So you can get some quite amazing looking columns and beams.